Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about heat illness here and get a little more casual. The heat illness regulation begins for employers at 80 degrees. So basically, heat illness can be initiated for, 10 or 11 months of the year here at Bakersfield, right? And that requirement means water, shade, having a program in place, making sure we have training, and requiring that you provide 1 quart of water per person per hour for each individual employee. Any outdoor workers, and for any industry that's agriculture, construction, manufacturing is accepted. It's outside of the reg. Landscapers. So any outdoor workplace has that requirement. And it doesn't matter how many employees you have. Once you have an employee, now you have to do it. So for the employees, it would certainly be part of that. For volunteers, from a Cal OSHA perspective, volunteers would not be required. That doesn't say that you have some liability in that, because I think that even a volunteer organization may have some liability in that the expectation is that you'll provide fluids, provide water, provide a safe place to volunteer. And so I certainly think, although Cal OSHA may not give you a citation for your volunteers, you certainly set yourself up for family members of a volunteer who may pass away to have that. So I know that there's a run in a local area, right, where the participant passed away from heat illness, and there was definitely some discussion about does this nonprofit organization have some liability in this runner's fatality. It ended up not being the case. There were some other health issues, and I think specifically it ended up that the autopsy showed some other factors that contributed that negated that liability. But I thought it led to that interesting. There's an expectation now. You work in the heat, you provide water, shade, provide people there that would be able to help you and cool you off or recognize that you're having symptoms, and initiate emergency procedures. Really interesting because you have to provide a way for that emergency response to come out. And so imagine that you're out there 10, 20 miles from the nearest fire department, hospital. You have to provide a way for them to find you. So there may not be an address, and you have to send people to the nearest cross intersection to then guide you back in. How do you stay in contact with employees who work in those areas? You have to really develop a system for emergency response that meets the standard in terms of that it makes sense and that you can get emergency responders there rather quickly, or have other employees that can provide that emergency response, and or both. So we would offer the document and the plan customized to them, asking them questions back and forth, offer the training, and guide them in terms of how they should provide water, shade. There's some curveballs in shade, and it like, hey, can a tree be shade? And things like if it's a citrus orchard, that typically the canopy on the citrus orchard goes all the way to the ground, then now that cannot be. Although obviously if you're under it is, because there's not airflow under it. Whereas like a mature almond orchard, which is canopied up higher, becomes shade and it has sufficient air movement under it. So we would provide consulting for your specific work site. And so comprehensive package, front to back, document, training, consulting for the curveballs that you might have. I surprise sometimes people with, for me it's personal. It does have meaning in that In my 13-year career, I've investigated 10 heat illness deaths that have been categorized as that. So I think sometimes we assume when we live in hot environments, we take it for granted. We have this assumption that people know what to do and how to take care of themselves. And investigating this, most of these deaths were not from people who were not familiar with the environment. There were a couple, but for the most part, they were people who had lived here and worked here, and they were caught by surprise because of something else that contributed to that, whether it was the night before they partied, so they were a little dehydrated, or during the day it was a little less temperature but more humidity, and so they had these contributing factors that led to someone who maybe was experienced and lived in the area but then passed away. And it's a true tragedy, because you just need to recognize those symptoms, pay attention, take a break, cool yourself off. It's a totally preventable death. I like to say there are basic symptoms of, hey, I feel sick. Headache, dizzy, nausea are the initial symptoms. And the very serious symptoms can be things like passed out, convulsions, throwing up, and then finally a really good way to determine between, say, a heat exhaustion, which may be recoverable just right on site, that you provide medical care. You cool them down, put them in the shade, cool water, drench their clothing, they recover and they're fine. To a heat stroke is that someone may progress, they're not able to cool down, and they'll actually stop sweating. And literally, when you stop sweating, if you're overheated, your body functions begin to shut down. And so the body protects itself, but eventually if you shut down the heart and the brain, you're dead. On the employee side, I seem to, the popular questions are, things like, do I have to have ice? And, do you provide Gatorade? And things like that, where the rule's really specific. It says, hey, you have to provide fresh, pure, potable, and cooled water. So there's some question around that. Oh, they don't have to provide me Gatorade. No, they don't have to provide ice. No, it just needs to be cooled. Well, there's a balance there. Some people like that cooled water, some people don't. And they'll say, hey, do I have to drink it? And, it becomes a choice. You need to stay hydrated, and you need to have good personal judgment. On the employer side, it's usually around things like, well, one, really, I got to provide a quart of water per person for each hour of exposure? And the answer, well, yes, that's really specific in the reg. So you're thinking, hey, well, when I go for a hike, I bring a gallon of water for that day, and they're doing the math, and they're going, oh, well, that's only good for the first 4 hours of a workday, if someone was to literally drink that. So there's a little of this, hey, Cal OSHA has made the law provided for the worst case scenario, right? So this is someone who's working really hard in a really hot environment, and they're sweating a lot, so they're utilizing a lot of water. And when I talk to extreme athletes who work out or exercise in very hot environments, that's the kind of quantity of water they drink, and that's where they made the reg. Whereas, we go hiking in the mountains, and if it's 100 degrees, we're going to stop. It's too hot. But we're still working here in the valley. So I get that question. And the other thing with employers, it tends to be, oh, I literally have to have the plan in the work site. So they're going, oh, this piece of paper booklet has to be in the work site. And they're going, but nobody reads this. Yeah, the rule is really specific. The plan has to be in the work site. Bam. So, you're having that plan sitting at the same place that you have the jugs of water and the shade canopy put in place. And just being really clear. Here's what the reg says. Here's what the regulation says. This is what employers are going. Well, they don't drink all that water. We have 2.5 gallons for them for their 10-hour day, or we have 5 gallons per person, and they never drink it, or whatever it is. How come we provide more? Well, you're providing more because also it's like ice. I had a guy call me the other day and say, hey, do we have to provide ice? No, but the water has to be cooled. And if you put it in a 5-gallon jug and it sits out in the sun all day and does not have ice in it, it is definitely not cooled at 3 o'clock in the afternoon if it's been 100 degrees. So, hey, should we put ice in that maybe even twice during that day to keep it cooled and fresh? Of course, we should. But it doesn't say you must provide ice. There are some really cool videos out there. They're mostly oriented around physical exercise inducing that heat illness. But that has a lot of impact of showing, hey, exactly how the process breaks down the cells in heat and has it so that your body doesn't function. And I think those have the biggest impact. There's a couple of really good ones that are just animated videos talking about kids exercising in it and how it's so preventable. If you recognize it, do it, really get them cooled down quickly, people can recover and be okay from it. So on one side, I have a little of I empathize with the employers in the fact of you can get really wrapped up in there's really specific details and there's a lot of rules, and sometimes we feel like just like when you get a parking ticket that you're like, wow, that's a silly rule, I was 2 feet into the red. But then the other side for me is, well, when you're 2 feet into the red and the ambulance couldn't access to save someone from a heart attack, you're like, that person deserved more than a parking ticket. And I would say that performance standard on heat illness is the same kind of thing. Oh, if you were to come to me complaining of symptoms, saying I'm dizzy and I've thrown up 3 times in the last hour, and I was like, don't worry about it, just go home, and you passed away, I think you have significant liability and you're doing a disservice. I don't think that's right from a human standpoint. Take care of that person. Make sure they get the water. Make sure they get to medical care. Get them checked out. Maybe it's not heat illness, maybe it's something else, but still you have a responsibility as a human and as an employer to go and do that, just in terms of do the right thing. There will be employers who do a really great job of this, and they'll set up misters and showers to cool people off. There is an interesting part of the reg that if you're not working in agriculture, you can use misters in place of shade. Don't ask me. I don't know why. I don't understand why you can or can't use it by industry, but for whatever reason, that's the way the regulation's written up. I would say do the common sense things, right? Schedule work that's going to be harder, physically harder, that more exercise earlier. One of the best things that people tend to do. Don't save the things that you don't want to do because they're difficult physically for the last part of the day. Do them early when it gets hot like that. It's one of the best prevention methods, because I think exercise and the effort really coincides with that. And really from a perspective of, don't come to work hungover is important. You're already coming in dehydrated. You're already coming in at a deficiency. So I think that it's, that's interesting to say, oh, that makes sense to us. Hey, don't come to work hungover, but in this case, you're putting your life at risk because you come to work hungover. Thanks for listening. I think heat illness is really important. I found that it's certainly one of the most important topics for outdoor workers, especially coming up in this time of the year. And so please take the opportunity to at least check that you have water, shade, a plan in place, and emergency response procedures, and that employees really understand what the symptoms are and that you take them seriously and take action. I think it can really prevent someone from getting hurt and also prevent you from getting in a lot of trouble.